Presentation of Continental European Union Club. Our guests are Olivier Védrine, European expert, club director, Olga Kurnosova, Russian politician, Veter Klimenko, chief editor of Russian Monitor website, and Oleksandr Khara. Po-persze,
we want to present this report about Minsk Agreements, because you have several agreements, and we think with our team, that's mean Illya Ponomarev, Oleksandr Khara, Olga Kurnosova, Fedor Klimenko, Volodymyr Polyovyi, and myself. We wrote this report with European analysis, EU analysis, with Ukrainian analysis, and with Russian analysis. And we are all agree to see that this report is impossible to implement. The Minsk Agreement is impossible to implement. In this report, we show that those agreements are only a tool for Putin and Moscow to disturb Ukraine and to continue to disturb the European Union. As you know, we have the result of the referendum in Netherlands, and this referendum is very negative. I want to do a parallelism between those Minsk agreements and what is happening now in Europe, with the example of the referendum in Netherlands. We know, and in this report also we underline that Putin has a target to do a reconquest, political reconquest of Ukraine, and to destroy as soon as possible the unity of the European Union. For that, he has some useful idiots in the extreme right and the extreme left party. In this report, we underline the fact also that all the European elite really doesn't understand the mentality of Putin and the mentality of the Russian diplomacy. In Europe, European Union, we are postmodern societies. That means we believe in a win-to-win operation. Putin is not in this way. He is not representative of a postmodern policy and a postmodern society. He is thinking like in the 19th century with classical politic way of thinking. In this report, we underline also that those Minsk agreements will be there to freeze the conflict in the Donbass. Then I will take the floor the second time for the conclusion, but I want to say that this is our first work of our think tank club, and that was we talked about that in our previous press conference, and that's our first work. We will have also a website, and in few days we will put this report on the website. Now I will take the floor to Oleksandr Khara.
Thank you.
First of all, I would like to say that, and probably these are obvious things, but I'd like to mention what's happening in the east of Ukraine and in our relations with Russian Federation. According to the resolution of the General Assembly of 1974, there are all signs that this is an armed aggression of Russian Federation. It started from Crimea, so one of our conclusions, which we believe is very important, is that the war started from Crimea and it cannot finish till Crimea is returned to Ukraine. Any speculations as to if there is certain truth in Donbass, and that will mean peace. These are groundless ideas. They have nothing in common with reality. The second thing, which is quite fashionable word, hybrid aggression or hybrid war. These are just fashionable words, but what's happening is a real armed aggression with elements from other spheres. As an example, you can see it in our report. We demonstrate two examples how Estonia was occupied in 1940. Same steps were made by the Soviet power, by the Soviet Union. First, they organized siege of Estonia, then they forced them to sign an agreement on mutual assistance. They brought in troops of the Red Army, and next day they announced that there's a new government which announced the elections in 2 weeks. The elections were held in the first meeting of the so-called Parliament of Estonian Republic, and that is quite symbolic. And they were also there were also the servicemen of Red Army there, but the next day they passed the declaration on accessing to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had a new republic, and we can make parallels with Crimea, but during this time the Russians learned how to do it faster. 50 days were enough to occupy Estonia, and 50 years it was under occupation. Crimea was occupied in 29 days. So we see that certain technologies were improved. As to Donbass, we can compare that with Transnistria, and this conflict based on the language issue. They were saying that Romania was trying to occupy Moldova, that they will be persecuting Russian-speaking Moldova citizens. That was the reason to use the representatives of 14th Army, which are still there. They are violating the commitments of Russian Federation of 1979 and 2003. They were to withdraw their troops, and secondly, they were to destroy a huge arsenal of weapons, which is a threat not just to Moldova, to their territorial integrity, but to Ukraine as well. So these are parallels. That means that there's no such thing as hybrid war. That is a real war, but it uses different methods. Also, all 24 years Ukraine was in the state of war. Basically, there was information war against us, humanitarian war, economic war. Now this is a hot phase of war. There are no reasons to believe that till Putin is ruling, there will be no peace in this country, and this aggressive policy will be preserved. The colleagues from Russia will tell what they believe, how they view the situation and the way out of the situation. I would like also to say that so-called Minsk Agreements, these agreements should have some legal status. These agreements have are neither domestic legislation nor the international acts. They are neither international agreement in accordance with the current legislation, so they should be called so-called Minsk Agreements. And also talking about definitions, we're calling, the authorities are calling those who are fighting against us in Donbass, I mean our citizens, terrorists or bandits, but that's not correct. There's no brief term, but they should be called regular and irregular illegal armed groups created, supported by Russian Federation. We can compare that with the SS units, which were formed practically in every republic of the Soviet Union and occupied European countries. People from those countries were serving Wehrmacht and SS. So again, we can compare these things. As to the mines which these agreements have, people say a lot about that for Ukrainian society, for the active part of Ukrainian society, for those who are negotiating within trilateral contact group. They are not acceptable, and thanks to their civilian position, we are not executing on the modalities. If we do that, that will mean that this conflict will be turned into Ukrainian domestic conflict. Second, they are saying that execution of by Ukraine of these agreements allows our Western partners to keep sanctions, but no one thinks that if we execute most of these commitments, then the West will have grounds to stop sanctions, because then main reason why they were introduced as the reaction to aggression, and then they were starting using the idea that as soon as Russia stops behaving like they are, when they execute Minsk agreements, then the sanctions will be raised. So if we execute them, then we will get a real civil conflict and the sanctions will be stopped. Another important thing is that the information which comes from Donbass means that the social economic structures and administration of the territories comes from Moscow. Then there are two army corps created, and there are trainings organized of Russian citizens. They have up to 30,000, about 7,000 the tanks. They have more tanks than Germany does, and this problem is developed for purpose to enlarge the conflict if it is not resolved politically. Then there's this concept of limited sovereignty. That will mean that we will not be able to take any decision as to European Euro-Atlantic integration, and then we will be either in the gray zone or we will be back within the orbit of Russian Federation, which is not acceptable for Ukrainian society. And my colleagues from Russian Federation will say that this will be bad for Russian society, which does not perceive the aggressive policy of the Kremlin. So, finishing that, I would like to say that the key things are the war in accordance with the Ukrainian legislation. From the point of view of the resolution of General Assembly, it started from Crimea. It should end by return of Crimea. The diplomatic relations should be stopped, despite non-professional comments of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that then the agreements it will be impossible to sign agreements and to conduct negotiations. There are 3 international conventions worth looking at. It's on international agreements, on diplomatic relations, and on consulate relations. cancelling diplomatic relations does not affect the international commitments in accordance with the conventions and agreements, and it does not influence the possibility to conduct political or other negotiations. Stopping diplomatic relations does not mean announcement of war. That does not mean that consulate relations will be interrupted or stopped. And that is when the Ukrainian government defends our citizens and our interests abroad. Taking into account the fact that Russian Federation is not a real democratic state, the possibilities of our diplomats are limited. We saw how councillors were not allowed to visit Nadia Savchenko. Russian Federation had to do that. So basically, if there's no consulate support, this will not worsen the situation, but this will help improve the situation by signing agreements with the third party. Either Ukrainian councils could become part of consulate or diplomatic mission of some other country like Switzerland, or we can agree that other country will be representing our interests.
Спекуляції щодо того, що ми маємо виконувати Мінські домовленості, адже вони мають якусь юридичну силу.
That the speculations that we should implement Minsk agreements, that's not reasonable. Then we should show to the world that there is no Ukrainian crisis. There is Putin's crisis, this imperial policy by Putin. It creates conflicts in the countries which they are unable to control via their pocket governments. This is the similar situation as with Georgia in the conflict with Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is the same result of the imperial policy of Russia. Unless we will describe this problem as such, we won't be able to assess it properly. With this, I would like to give the floor to Olga Kurnosova. Oleksandr rather fully described the essence of our report. I would like to draw your attention to additional details of our report. So the title, the highlight of our conference is Minsk Agreements, a way to peace or to further violence. I think that the biggest threat of Minsk Agreements is the peace, is the calming down effect. It calms down the concerned thoughts in Europe, in the United States, and even in Ukraine. It pretends that this is the way to reach ceasefire, but we observe that even a ceasefire regime could not be reached due Minsk Agreement. It's important to understand why this happens, why Minsk Agreements are not implementable in principle. From the very beginning, they were drafted in a way which could not be implemented, which are impossible to be implemented. From the very beginning, there were some items, some provisions which could not be implemented by Ukraine, by Russia, and which are very inconvenient for the Europeans. And that mixed of different unacceptable provisions was brought together into one document. This is a document for freezing up the conflict, for extending the duration of this conflict, but not for the conflict resolution. It is important to understand that current Russian leadership is the reincarnation of the Soviet Union leadership, which in the period when it was rather aggressive, when it stirred up the situation in the world. What has changed is the quasi-empire and quasi-ideology, the ideology of the Russian world. The latest events prove that I'm right. Some days ago, Putin has signed a decree about establishing the National Guard. The National Guard is very similar to the SS in the Third Reich. The way how it is formed, the weaponry with which they are equipped, and their power to shoot into their own citizens, it's like the Nazi legislation. We never heard about such permit for the law enforcers to open unwarned fire without any warning. That's a novelty. This is the autocracy with huge elements of totalitarianism. Another important moment which I would like to mention, which was mentioned by Olivier already, the results of the yesterday's referendum in the Netherlands. What do we see in the results of the referendum? We see that that Russia is carrying out very aggressive informational work in the informational space in Europe and everywhere in the world. Ukraine lags behind, and it does not tackle this aggressive work. And why I mentioned the Soviet Union, that this construction absolutely unreal, absolutely deceitful. That is what the Soviet Union used to the famous case of Saka and Vanzetti. What a powerful information campaign was raged around that case, and how deceitfully the Kremlin propaganda acted, and Kremlin is rather successful in this propaganda, even more successful than Dr. Goebbels' propaganda in the Nazi Germany. When the conflict in Donbass remains very hot conflict, actually, every day we read that people continue to die because of the conflict. It is important to understand why it's happening. It's important to understand that Putin and his regime could not be convinced, could not be calmed down, could not be brought to the civilized channel, so to say. So unless we manage to curb this regime, they will stir up similar conflicts everywhere. And the only possibility for Ukraine to cope with this conflict is to act more proactively to bring Russia to normal democratic path. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Fyodor Klimenko. Good afternoon. The previous speakers speaking about Minsk Agreements mentioned that one of the main problems of the conflict in the east of Ukraine and of all other conflicts in the post-Soviet space is the politics and policy of Kremlin and Putin. For us, it's obvious that the main problem here is the main problems could not be resolved without democratic transit in Moscow, without each of the conflicts around. Russian borders could not be resolved. I would like to provide an example, relatively recent example. In 1991, the troops of the international coalition led by the United States, when they threw out the Iraqi conquerors from Kuwait, did not go further to Iraqi territory, and then in 10 years, they faced even the most acute problem of Iraqi terrorists. And the Islamic State organization raised from that Iraqi terrorist organizations, and today the Western coalition decided to freeze the conflict. George Bush at that time said Saddam Hussein's fate now depends on the Iraqi people, but unfortunately the nation, which is under the power of a dictatorship, of a dictator, they cannot destroy this dictator, and it's very difficult to establish democratic regime. Both Western communities and the Ukrainian authorities should clearly understand that today it's impossible to count for success of Minsk Agreements, and to think that that the life during one period in office for bureaucrats will be quiet and peaceful. I think that in some years the situation may deteriorate, and I believe that within one generation, Russia may find itself behind the Iron Curtain. And in this case, behind that Iron Curtain, the very dangerous transformations may happen, especially keeping in mind the availability of nuclear weapons in this country.
Your nice analysis. I share, of course, we are in the same way of thinking, but I want to do a conclusion for the future. We are 6 member founders of this club, but we are not only 6, we are more. A lot of our friends are in Russia, but they don't want to be officially on our website or in our work because they are afraid. Personally, and with our friend, we are writing in some very important newspaper like Kasparov.ru openrussia.ru. Fedor is also the chief editor of Ruski Monitor. We also publish in grani.ru. A lot of our friends are in Russia, and I repeat, they don't want to be officially mentioned in our club because they're afraid. That's why I believe that we don't have to be in defensive, we have to be in offensive activity. That's why our next report and next work will be to propose some ideas for a program for the Russian position. We started to work on that. We know a lot of them, and we will propose in a few weeks some ideas for a new program. We will support the transition, democratic transition in Russia. We think that Putin will be over in very quickly, not far away from now, not more than 2 or 3 years. And we are to prepare the post-Putin period. That's why we are working on that. And our next conference will be, I think, about some Russian proposal for opposition program. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, друзья. Есть ли вопросы или уточнения к спикеру?
Dear speaker, dear friends, do you have any questions to the speakers? Maidan Press Center. I'm Bogdan. In March, we heard several predictions about escalation of the conflict in the east of Ukraine. There were, for example, several predictions about possible full-scale offensive on behalf of Russia in Donbass. How do you assess the possibility?
Putin need to stay in the war. Then for him the war is a good political product to stay in the power. As you know, he increased the propaganda, nationalist propaganda, and I think now he cannot leave Donbass. This is impossible politically. If tomorrow he will leave Donbass, that means a lot of people on the Donbass will say officially that Russian troops were there. And what do you think about all those mother or wife of the soldiers who died on Donbass? They will come to see where their husband or their son are. And that's for the Russian propaganda and for the Putin regime, that's the end. Because the truth will come. That's why I believe never Putin will leave Donbass. Now maybe Alexander, if you want to add something.
Дякую. Значить, я б
I would say it's so that, first of all, Ukraine is surrounded from 3 sides but by non-friendly states. I would include Belarus. Despite what President Lukashenko says, Belarus is a military political ally of Russian Federation. There are Russian military bases there. There's aviation and missile component located there. The second part is Transnistria and Crimea, which we unfortunately do not have technical means or technical resources to defend the south of our country, the coast and our communications. Will there be a large-scale campaign or not? It depends on whether Putin can achieve same objectives in a different way. Then the forces in the regions. We saw in Mukachevo there was a statement made depending on the reaction of Kiev, these processes will develop faster or not. Also, we know there are objective grounds to look at the president with a big criticism, but there is an attempt to deteriorate the situation, to create political crisis, and during the political crisis, the special operation can be started. I wouldn't exclude large-scale campaign, even though it will hurt Putin, but there is certain logic in it. He believes that the West is so weak politically and economically, and if he survives this war for some time, and they will start talking to him as like with big power, he will catch up. Thank you. Alexander's right. For Putin, economic issues are very important. In Russia, there is a very big economic crisis. The military operation in Syria costs a lot. It hurts the economy, especially in conditions of crisis. So that you understand, the budget of St. Petersburg today has 15% of deficit. That is the situation which hadn't been happening for a long time. So the economic situation is very bad for Putin. And I believe that large-scale operation is not highly probable, but the deterioration of the situation, yes. There's enough life force and weapons in these regions. Talking about possible scenario, I believe this is increasing the degree of the conflict. So thank you. We will finish our press conference. Good luck and see you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Колеги, на цьому робочий день в українському кризомедіа-центрі завершено. Завтра перший брифінг рівно о 10 ранку. Міністерство